Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here with you this morning. Obviously, no substitute for being with you in person, but actually, I'm really pleased that I can join you online this morning, and it's just great to be here. So thank you for having me. There's lots of words that have become familiar in our language over this season, aren't there? Like, these are unprecedented times. Sorry, I know that many of you will be wanting me to put a pound in a swear jar for having said unprecedented. But we do live in strange times, the likes of which most of us have never seen in our lifetimes. And there's so much uncertainty all around us at the moment. We don't know what's going to happen. Just recently, some areas of the country have gone back into lockdown. People are worried about what's going to happen in the winter months and when the furlough scheme ends. And maybe some of you watching are worried. You're living with this uncertainty about how you personally are going to be affected, or how your family's going to be affected, or maybe it's your loved ones, or just people around you in your workplaces, or just in your life in general. And you know that there's just people who are living with this fear of the unknown, of what's coming, of so much being uncertain all around us. Well, I'm going to come on to talk about that and the times in which we live and what we can do with some of that uncertainty a little bit later. But I wanted to start this morning by talking about something that hasn't changed, something that has remained exactly the same, that is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that is never going to change. And that is God's compassion and mercy. God is a merciful God. He has always been merciful. He will always be merciful. And his mercy is particularly lavished upon those who are struggling with or trapped in poverty and injustice. You know, when God created this world in which we live, there actually was no poverty. Because there was no sin, because there was no sickness, because there was nothing broken about the world when God created it. Actually, poverty couldn't exist in God's perfect creation. There were no natural disasters, so people wouldn't find themselves hungry or homeless or things like that because of circumstances beyond their control. But also, because there was no sin, it meant that we couldn't fall victim to the greed or selfishness of other people. Actually, there was no way that I could suffer because of your actions, or vice versa. God created this world that was perfect and beautiful and wonderful. But then when sin came into the world, so many other things came with it. The possibility of poverty, injustice, sickness, death, all these things that show us how broken the world around us is. So as soon as sin came in, the potential for poverty came with it. And it wasn't long before poverty was just part of the world around us. And it is to this day. And ever since poverty came in, it has been a vital and pressing concern for God. It's been something that God is not immune to, he's not oblivious to, he's not uncaring about. It's something that God cares passionately about. God doesn't want people to be trapped in poverty. God doesn't want people to suffer because of greed or selfishness. God doesn't want people to be oppressed by injustice. And we see this all throughout the Bible. Wherever we look in the Bible, we see that God's mercy is particularly focused on those who are trapped in poverty or injustice. And this is actually because of God's nature. It's because by nature he is compassionate, by nature he is merciful, and he is completely unchanging in that. He doesn't kind of wake up one day and he's in a bad mood, so he's not merciful that day. Actually, we can trust and rely on the compassion and mercy of God to be the same day after day after day after day. And that's a really beautiful and wonderful thing. And I want to just quickly turn to Exodus 34. If you've got a Bible, you might want to turn to it. But if you haven't, don't worry about it. I'm going to read it anyway. But in Exodus 34, what we see is there's this guy, Moses, who basically says to God, "Show me your glory. I want to see your glory." And I don't know about you, but, you know, as I ponder that, I think, what's God going to do? If God's going to show Moses his glory, what sort of things might he do? Maybe in front of Moses, he'll just create a new planet and then say, look at that. Maybe he'll create a new animal and say, there you go, there's some of my glory. Maybe he'll thunder from the heavens and shake the whole earth, and then Moses will be in awe, just struck by the glory of God. Or maybe God will pick up a mountain and move it in front of Moses. You know, God could do any of these things that would reveal something of his glory. But he doesn't do any of that. Instead, he invites Moses to come up the mountain, where what he says is, as he reveals his glory, it says this in Exodus 34, the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with Moses there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. What's amazing to me here is that when God is revealing his glory to Moses, when Moses is getting just about as close to God as it was possible to get before Jesus came, the primary way that God identifies himself, the primary way that God reveals his glory is to say, I'm a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. I think this is so beautiful that this is how God chooses to reveal himself to Moses, that this is the primary way. It might not be what we expect. We might think that God in his power or his might or as a creator, that might be the essence of his glory. But here we see that it's actually his character, his merciful, gracious nature, that he is patient with us. He's slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. I love the word abounding there. It's not a little trickle. It's lavish, it's overwhelming, and it's beautiful and wonderful. And then if we kind of move forward a bit in the Bible into the New Testament, that's the later section of the Bible, we read about Jesus, who it tells us is the exact representation of God. So it shouldn't be any surprise to us to see that Jesus starts his whole ministry actually by revealing the merciful character of God, by revealing God's heart of mercy and compassion for those who are in poverty. In Luke chapter 4, we see this. We see Jesus starts his whole ministry. It says that he's in the synagogue teaching, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say to them, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. What I think's particularly interesting to me here is that Jesus was handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, but he didn't just kind of stick his finger in like this and choose a passage based on that. He wasn't handed a specific passage. It says that he found the place where it is written. Jesus deliberately and intentionally started his ministry reading this passage of the Old Testament from Isaiah 61, that the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor. It's about bringing liberty to the captives. It speaks of the incredible mercy of God and the compassion of God, that the very focus of the ministry of Jesus was going to be the poorest, was going to be the most vulnerable. In fact, we see this all through the Gospels. If you read the Gospels, you'll see Jesus spent so much of his time with those who the rest of society wanted nothing to do with, those who were despised, those who were shunned, those who were told, you're sinners, we don't want to have anything to do with you. Those who, if you'd said, how are these people contributing to society? Some of the religious leaders of the day would say they've got nothing to offer. You can forget about them. You don't need to pay attention to them. They're the exact people that Jesus spent so much of his time with. And when he starts his ministry here in Luke 4, there's this invasion of heaven to earth. And when it comes, it's about miracles. It's about signs and wonders. It's about healing. It's about all those glorious things. But it's also about another glorious thing, which is that those in poverty get lifted up out of their poverty. That those who are oppressed get set free, their chains get broken. It's so beautiful and so wonderful that this is the ministry of Jesus. This is the good news of the gospel. If you're watching this and you don't know Jesus and you wonder why we sing and why we get excited and why we're passionate about Jesus and why we want to tell people about him, it's because he's so beautiful. He's so kind. He's so tender-hearted. He's so compassionate. And in his mercy, he draws us to himself. And if you're watching this and you're thinking, well, I've got nothing to offer, I've done some awful things. I've thought some awful things. Actually, the wonderful news for you is that Jesus says, come and experience the mercy and the love of the Father for you. It's beautiful and it's wonderful. But what is, to me, even more staggering is that for those of us who follow Jesus, he invites us to come and be like him. In Luke 6, verse 36, Jesus says, be merciful, just as the Father is merciful. This merciful God who revealed himself to Moses, who showed his glory, and his glory was found in the fact that he's a merciful, compassionate God, full of love, full of faithfulness. And then Jesus invites us, you and me, with all our flaws, all our failings, all our weaknesses, and he says, be merciful just as the Father is merciful. It's a wonderful invitation to us. And if ever there was a time to be merciful, surely it's now. Surely it's during this coronavirus pandemic. For some, it might be a time to kind of bunk down and withdraw and think about making sure you and your household are okay. But for the Christian, it's a time to step up in the mercy of God. It's a time to step up and step out and be more generous, more compassionate, more kind, more merciful than we've been before. Jesus is inviting us to be really radical in the mercy that we show to those around us at this time. And you know, during the coronavirus pandemic, if I'm honest with you, I've had a tendency, certainly at the beginning of the crisis and at the beginning of lockdown, to be quite self-centered, to be quite self-absorbed. When the coronavirus pandemic hit the UK, I lost some of my income. I was worried about if I have to isolate. I live on my own. I was worried that if I had to spend 14 days on my own, I knew that would be bad for my mental health. As someone who has a tendency towards depression, I knew it was going to be a struggle for me if that happened. I don't have a garden. I realised a few weeks in that even though I'm not particularly a huggy person, I was missing human contact because I've had to socially distance. I hadn't, until we were allowed to go into a bubble, I hadn't been able to even touch another human being and even lay hands on someone to pray for them, put your hand on someone's shoulder. And I wouldn't have expected to miss those things, but I started to notice that I was missing them. I started to worry about things like, well, if I have to isolate, how am I going to buy food? How am I going to do my shopping? Am I going to run out of toilet roll? I'm sure you remember back in March, many of us had those same concerns. There were all sorts of reasons why I was worried. Some of my income comes through traveling around, speaking, writing, things like that. That all stopped. Our book, I had a book due to come out in June, that got postponed. There were lots of things that I thought actually I could be very anxious about. And I started to worry about those things. And I started to think about how the coronavirus pandemic was having a really negative impact on me. But actually, very quickly, as I started to pray about it, I felt God point out to me really clearly so much of my privilege. So much about the fact that actually, although I'd lost some of my income, I still had enough to live on. And that wasn't the case for many people around me. The fact that I lived on my own and some of my friends were tearing out their hair because they've got 6 children and they can't get away from them. They can't get a moment's peace because they're all in lockdown together. I started to maybe appreciate a bit more that at least I have a roof over my head and that that's not under threat at the moment due to coronavirus. I started to realise quite quickly that actually that while the coronavirus pandemic was actually a pretty big inconvenience for me, it wasn't a catastrophe. Whereas for many around us, many in our communities, actually this season has been catastrophic. There are people who lost their jobs right at the start or who are at fear of losing their jobs as we go into the autumn. There are people who are worried because they've maybe been furloughed and that 20% income that they've lost through being furloughed is the money they used to spend on feeding their family. There are people who are getting into rent arrears and debt. There are business owners who run seasonal businesses. Where I live in Hastings on the coast, there's so many businesses that are seasonal and without a good summer, they won't survive the winter. There's many around us who are fearful about catching coronavirus or their loved ones catching it. There are those around us who've lost loved ones, who are grieving. or who have just been worried about their preschool kids who've just not had any contact with other kids through most of this time. And what impact will that have on them? Will it have an impact on them for the long term? There's lots of people around us who are experiencing this season not as an inconvenience, but as a catastrophe. Maybe you're in that situation. If you are, God has mercy, fresh mercy for you this morning. But if you're someone who, like me, actually has found it to be more of an inconvenience than a catastrophe, then what can we do at this time? How can we be merciful just as the Father is merciful at this time? I think there are 3 particular ways that we can show God's heart of mercy to those around us who are struggling during this season, and actually really at all times. The first one for me that I've felt God really challenged me about is, what am I going to do with my money? Sorry, I know this is an uncomfortable subject for some. I know that money isn't perhaps something we like to talk about in Britain particularly, but I think it's really important that in this season we think about actually a really practical way that we can show mercy to our communities, to our loved ones, even to strangers on the street, is by what we do with our money. You know, John Wesley, who is one of the most famous preachers, evangelists of the last couple of hundred years, he felt compelled by God to use his money for the good of the poorest. And what this meant for him was that one year, when he was 28 years old, he earned £30 in that year. Obviously, it was a long time ago. He earned £30 and he needed £28 to live on. So what he did was he kept the £28 that he needed for himself just to survive, to live viably in his society, and he gave away the other £2. But the next year, his income doubled. He suddenly earned £60. But actually, he still only needed £28 to live on. So he kept £28 and he gave away 32. That's pretty radical, isn't it? Giving away more than 50% of his income. Instead of thinking, well, maybe I'll save it because I don't know what's going to happen next year, he gave it away to the poorest, to those in need, to those who had less than he had. The next year, he earned £90 and he did exactly the same thing. He kept £28 and he gave away 62. At the peak of his earnings, John Wesley earned £1,400 in a year. And even that year, he kept £30 that he needed to live on, and he gave all the rest away. Isn't that challenging? I feel challenged by that. I feel like, God, I want to give my money to you in a way that isn't about saying, well, you can have this little bit or that little bit. But I also recognize in my heart this desire to cling to what I've got. This desire to make sure I'm okay, and especially in uncertain times, to think about, well, you know, I better keep any extra that I've got aside because I don't know what the winter's going to hold. But actually, I believe God is calling Christians to be on the front foot with generosity at this time, not to hoard what we have, not to keep it for ourselves, but actually to be more generous in this season, to be more lavish. Particularly at the start of lockdown when panic buying was happening, we had an opportunity then, and I'm sure we will again if that happens again, to instead of thinking I want to make sure I've got enough loo roll and hand sanitizer for myself, to think about who can I share with? Can I share it with my neighbours? Can I share it with my family? Actually, at the beginning of lockdown, I called my mum and said, I'm running out of toilet roll. How much have you got? And she was like, oh, I can probably give you a couple. And actually she was quite generous to me. When I actually went round to get it, she gave me quite a lot. Whether it's toilet roll, whether it's hand sanitizer, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's money, there's an opportunity for us as followers of Jesus to imitate God by being merciful with our money. For me, I hear this story about John Wesley and I'm provoked by it because it's so countercultural. It's not what happens in our society. And as someone who speaks on poverty a lot, I thought I'd do a little exercise. I went through 2 months of my bank statements. This was prior to coronavirus, prior to lockdown. I went through 2 months worth of my bank statements and I put everything into categories as essential, luxury, giving away, or then I had a grey area. So a grey area was things like life insurance, which is a luxury but doesn't feel like one. But under essential, I was very kind to myself. I put things like every supermarket shop that I did, I put the whole shop as essential, even though I know full well that I bought things like wine, which rumour has it is not actually essential. Sorry if that's the most controversial thing I'll say this morning. I put my phone bill, my mobile phone bill, my broadband, I classed those things as essential, petrol, things like that. So I was very generous to myself in the essential category. And I'll be honest with you, because I speak about this sort of thing a lot, I thought I was probably doing pretty well. I probably had a little bit of a sense of smugness as I went into this exercise, a little bit of maybe self-righteousness of thinking, well, I'm probably doing okay. And what I found to my shock, actually, was that well over a quarter of my income was spent on luxury, was spent on things I didn't need. And you might think, well, a quarter's not that bad. But for me, I was quite shocked by it because I thought, actually, I just felt provoked by God with this question. Is it ever okay for me to have way more than I need while there are people around me who don't have the basics that they need? Is it ever okay for me to have way more than I need while there are people around me who don't have the essentials that they need? And I'm pretty sure, as sobering as it is, as disruptive to our comfort as it is, that the answer is no. That the answer is that if we have more than we need, God wants us to be lavish with our generosity in the same way that he is lavish with his generosity. And that's one of the primary ways that we can show mercy to others is by what we do with our money and by living counterculturally with our finances and with our possessions. Another thing is what we do with our meal tables. I know that at the moment it's difficult because we're not allowed to do certain things with our homes. We're not allowed to have that many people around. But as lockdown eases and as we move out of it, I'm really challenged by God as to what am I going to do with my meal table? Because Jesus ate with people who others despised. Jesus ate with Matthew, the tax collector. He ate with Zacchaeus, who was someone who we can infer from the text actually had defrauded other people. He had exploited other people. Jesus ate with him. Jesus ate with Simon the leper. I think if Simon the leper invited me to dinner, I might have a few questions before I'd accept that invitation. Jesus doesn't seem to hesitate in going to eat with Simon the leper, someone that everyone else would have avoided at all costs. But he also ate with Simon the Pharisee, who was probably judgmental and religious and self-righteous and looked down on other people. Jesus ate with all sorts of people that you and I might find it difficult to comprehend. But actually, we have an opportunity to eat with people who we might disagree with about all sorts of things. Our lives might look very different, and we have an opportunity to welcome people into our homes. I was at a conference a few years ago with Jackie Pullinger, who some of you will have heard of. She's quite well known in some Christian circles for the work that she's done in Hong Kong in reaching out to drug addicts, prostitutes, people in gangs, some of the poorest, but some who many would despise as being those who exploit other people. But she's reached out to them, seen many, many people set free of addictions, come to know Jesus and be set free. And I was at a conference with her, and she said that so many of us in church in particular can find it really easy to share the food of the church or of the food bank or of the soup kitchen. But when it comes to sitting down and having meals with people ourselves, we shy away from that. And she pointed out that people in poverty can tell the difference. People in poverty can tell when we hold them at arm's length and say, you're welcome to the table at the church where I can then go home, but I wouldn't have you in my own home. And you know, for me, as a single woman in the church, having meals with others is one of the key ways that for me, I have experienced the love of God, that I've experienced the church as family. Actually, just last year, I managed to go 46 days in a row eating with friends and not having to feed myself. I think that's a pretty amazing achievement. I'm quite proud of that. Some people called me a sponger or a scrounger. But you know what? Through it, God revealed something of his love to me, of family, of the fact that I am in a community of believers that isn't just somewhere I go on a Sunday or midweek. I mean, thank God for that, because at the moment I can't do that. But it's somewhere where I find people who will break bread with me, both kind of literally and metaphorically, It's somewhere where I find people who will sit down and share their meal table, share their homes with me, share their families with me, and let me be part of their homes. And that speaks volumes to me, but I know that it speaks volumes to others as well. So there's an opportunity to be merciful with our money and merciful with our meal tables. I think another way we get to express the mercy of God is through who we're mates with. Money, meal tables, mates. Who are you friends with? Have you got any friends who embarrass you? Have you got any friends who come out with things that make you wince? I remember once sitting in a meeting with the leader of my church, and I just got my phone out because we were trying to put a meeting in the diary to next meet together. And so I had my phone down on the table, and I suddenly saw this text message come up that had the vilest language in it. I flipped my phone over so fast that I'm surprised the leader of my church has never asked me what I'm up to or what was going on, because I didn't want him to see the language that had come through. But actually, it's good for us to have friends who aren't like us. It's good for us to have close friends, people we love and adore and cherish, who actually would embarrass us with maybe the way they speak or the opinions they hold or the attitudes they have. It's really important that we don't just spend time with people like us. Because actually, if we do that, we never will be challenged in our thinking. We'll have quite a narrow worldview. We won't have a broad worldview, but we also will be limited in our opportunities to show mercy to those around us. I've mentioned already that Jesus called Matthew, the tax collector, to be his disciple. Isn't it interesting that Jesus called his disciples as people who actually wouldn't have got on, naturally speaking? Matthew, the tax collector, would have taken taxes from the fishermen who were among the disciples. Those fishermen, how do you think they felt about Matthew? When they would have been shocked probably that Jesus would call someone like Matthew, who would have made his own money by exploiting his own people and exploiting them not just for his own benefit, but also to give money to their oppressors, the Romans. It would have been hard for the disciples at first to come alongside one another, to be friends, to be brothers actually together. But it's no accident that Jesus called people from very different backgrounds who would have naturally not got on at all to be part of his inner circle, part of his 12 closest people, part of his 12 who were going to go and actually start the church. It was a deliberate thing because it models something to us about being friends with people who in the natural we might not get along with, who left to our own devices we might have nothing in common with. We might even feel really strongly against what they stand for. But actually we are called to be those who show mercy, even to those we disagree with. The passage I mentioned, Luke 6 verse 36, where it says that God is to be merciful like our Father is merciful. Actually, it goes on to say that God is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Now, if I'm making a list about who I want to be kind with, I can assure you that the ungrateful and wicked are not at the top of that list. In fact, they're not even on my list. But actually, God isn't just kind to the kind. God isn't just kind to the good. God is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. And we have an opportunity in these days to be like him. In fact, it's what Jesus is calling us to. If you're a follower or a worshipper of Jesus Christ, he is calling you to be merciful, to be radical, to be a radical mercy bringer. We sang the song earlier, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. We have an example to be like God in pouring out mercy, not a little bit here and there, not a little bit when we think people deserve it. But we have an opportunity to pour out mercy to those we think deserve it and those we think don't. To those who we're naturally compassionate towards and those we actually think, you don't deserve any compassion from me at all. Actually, like God, we get to be kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Our God is a God who is full of mercy, full of compassion, especially for those around us for whom coronavirus is a catastrophe. Especially for those around us for whom coronavirus has either pushed them into poverty for the first time or has trapped them even deeper into poverty at this time. It's a beautiful invitation we have from Jesus. Be merciful just as the Father is merciful. And what a time to step into that with all we've got, with all our being. In Jesus' name, amen.